Hi, everybody. Welcome to Reading Isaiah, Past, Present, Future. Here's what we're going to do today. We just had a moment to introduce ourselves. Now I'm going to introduce this series. I'm going to orient today's conversation around four questions: why, how, who, and what. So why? Why are we doing this Bible study, and why are we doing it now? Well, firstly, Isaiah probably ranks right next to any one of the Gospels as one of the most influential books in the Christian world, and indeed in the world in general. There's a whole variety of folks who have used Isaiah for a whole variety of reasons. In the write-up for this class, I mentioned Dr. Martin Luther King, Toni Morrison, and Jane Addams in particular, but that list extends. We'll talk at the very end, the last session, about how people have really used Isaiah in a variety of ways. But just a little preview, in Toni Morrison's book, Beloved, there's a character, Baby Shugs, who actually preaches a message of comfort and empowerment that has a lot in common with many of the passages in Isaiah in terms of its structure and in terms of its content. So we'll talk about that near the end. Dr. Martin Luther King uses the book of Isaiah and quotes directly from it in his I Have a Dream speech and in other speeches. And then also, Isaiah is quoted and referenced and used over 60 times in the New Testament. It's used 21 times in the Gospels, 25 times in Paul's letters, 6 times in 1 Peter, 5 times in Acts, 4 times in Revelations, and once in Hebrews. And so there are actually traditions in ancient Christian writings of calling Isaiah the fifth gospel, because it is considered to be good news that heralds the coming of Jesus. And so, let's talk about how we're going to dive into this book, which is one of the longest in the Bible, is one of, I think, the most inspiring in many ways, but then also one of the most complex because of its history, because of its structure. So I'm going to share my screen and just give you a quick glance at how we're going to structure our time together over the 5 weeks of this Bible study. So today we're talking about why, how, who, what. Next week, on December 11th, we'll talk about the passages in Isaiah oriented around justice. There's a lot of talk about protecting the orphans and bringing comfort to the widows and releasing the captives and liberating the oppressed. And so next week will be a deep dive into those passages. Then we'll talk about the ways that Christians have used a lot of those ideas to talk about Jesus. And we'll look directly at some of the passages from the Christmas story, some of the passages in the four Gospels that talk about quoting Isaiah, the Messiah. We'll talk about how we got to the idea of a virgin birth, how that's rooted in Isaiah and translations of particular passages in Isaiah. And we'll talk about the whole Christmas story and why Isaiah is read so frequently in the lead up to Christmas and in Advent. Then we'll talk about second Isaiah. What does that mean? I'll get into that in just a little bit when we talk about the structure of the book. But the first part of Isaiah, in summary, has a lot to do with complaint. God is saying to the people of Judah through Isaiah that they are not doing things correctly. And so there's a lot of discussion about ways they need to reform, things they need to do. And then in second Isaiah, though, we move very abruptly from conversation about complaint, God critiquing and complaining about the Judeans, to discussion about comfort. And it's a pretty abrupt shift. And so we'll talk about why that shift happens and what's being talked about. in second Isaiah, those chapters from second Isaiah. And then, as I mentioned, lastly, we'll talk about how folks have read, interpreted, and used Isaiah to comment on the times that they lived in, to inspire literary production, to inspire social movements, to inspire a whole variety of things. And so, I'm going to point out really quickly that you'll notice there's a gap here. After the 18th, we'll actually take a break. We won't meet on Christmas, and then we won't meet on New Year's Day. And so during that time, I'm going to invite you to do a little bit of reading, actually, that I'll talk about when we get nearer that time. And then we'll pick the Bible study back up on January 8th. Any questions about the structure here? Okay. So let's begin with who. Or we've gone into how, let's go into who. Take a look at this very beginning part of Isaiah, what's called the superscription for this book. Okay, do y'all see that? Okay, so here we are, Isaiah 1, verse 1. This actually appears in many texts as sort of in italics. Again, it's a superscription. This is a little introduction to what's coming next. And so here we get the vision concerning Judah and Jerusalem that Isaiah, son of Amos, saw during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. And so if you notice, just a little technical thing that I'm going to invite you to continue to track as we move through. This very first verse is in prose, and then what follows is in verse. And so what we'll see throughout the book of Isaiah is poetry interspersed with prose. And I'll go into a little bit about what that says to us and why that's important in just a little bit. But first, let's just stick with this. The vision concerning Judah and Jerusalem that Isaiah, son of Amos, saw. So Isaiah, many scholars believe, there's every reason to believe, was an actual human person. That can't be said for certain about some of the other folks to whom different biblical books have been ascribed. Isaiah, though, we have archaeological evidence that suggests he was a live human person. He was a prophet, again, in the courts of these four kings. And the role of a prophet who was installed in the court was to consult with the king, was to be sort of the instrument through which Yahweh spoke and advised the king. And so in much of the prophetic literature that we see in Isaiah and Amos and Hosea, in Ezekiel, the books can go on, there's often moments where the prophet will say, "The Lord said to me," and then a long, often verse or poetic description of whatever was reported to the prophet from Yahweh. Now, Isaiah, though, this book is one of the longest in the Bible, as I mentioned. It's 66 chapters, it's over 25,000 words. Now, Isaiah probably had one of the longest careers of an official prophet in Hebrew history. However, there were other prophets who were also working at the same time as Isaiah, just in different places, in different functions, actually. So while Isaiah was speaking as a courtly prophet, you might remember the prophet Amos. Amos was also speaking, however, he was not installed in the court. He wasn't an official central intermediary. he was someone who was sort of a freelance prophet, someone who was maybe a street corner prophet, somebody who was out there unaffiliated with the court, who was also prophesying, speaking on behalf of Yahweh. And so Hosea is another prophet that was also outside the realm of the Judean kingdom, who was also prophesying and speaking on behalf of on behalf of Yahweh. It's important here to take a moment to talk a little bit about history, because we're talking about Judah and Israel. Now, for those of us who are unfamiliar with biblical history, you might be wondering, all right, well, what are these things? Why are we referring to these two different places, or what does that even mean? Well, I'm going to show you a map of why we keep referring to Israel and Judah. It's because they were two separate kingdoms. Up until the invasion of the Assyrians and eventually the Babylonians, Israel was the northern kingdom, often referred to as Ephraim, because that was the tribe of the Hebrews who had the most power in the northern kingdom. And then the southern kingdom, Judah, again named for the tribe that was most in power during that time. And so here, looking at this map, you see Jerusalem, which is the center of gravity for the southern kingdom. And then here in the northern kingdom, the capital, Samaria. And so when we hear later on, particularly in the Gospels, a lot of conversation about the Samaritans, these are the people we're talking about. The people from the northern kingdom who were separated in many ways, culturally and even in some ways religiously, from the people of the southern kingdom, from the people of Judah, also known as Judea. If you take a look over here, you see another country called Philistia, which is the place where the Philistines lived. In modern day terms, we would be talking about the Palestinians. And so here we get a sense, I'm just going to footnote that in a way, comparing this map with a modern day map, where eventually Israel becomes a fully separate state, an integrated state, which is its own history. But this realm that we saw over here, which was much larger, known as Philistia, is now the Gaza Strip. And the West Bank over here, let me see if I can go back. You see, there are these other competing kingdoms and people groups who are in this area that eventually, due to European colonialism, gets collapsed and moved back, and then gets turned into Jordan and Syria and Lebanon up here. So that's just a little bit of kind of contextual historical information about where literally in the world we're talking about right now. And so if you remember back to that superscription, it says, the vision of Isaiah, son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. And so Isaiah is working in the realm of the southern kingdom. Any questions about that so far? Yeah, Carla.
And what time frame are we talking about
Yeah, good
for
question.
Isaiah?
Yeah, so that's going to get into a little bit of dispute when we're talking about 1st and 2nd Isaiah, but for now I'll just say that we're talking about the 8th century BCE. So we're talking about the mid 700s. And while this period of time in which there's these two separate kingdoms, meanwhile there are these other empires surrounding the area that are starting to try to push the boundaries and the borders of particularly Syria and Israel. Did that answer your question, by the way, Carla? Okay. So, Isaiah, to go more into your question, Isaiah was written during a time of national tensions between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, prompted by international imperial struggles. And so this book, many people believe, was written, excuse me, in the context of these shifting imperial invasions. And so this is a map that shows where the Assyrian Empire lived, essentially. And so the Syro-Ephraimite War is important for us as kind of background context for this book, because here's what was going on. The Assyrian Empire was wanting to take more and more land west of where it was. And so there were these little skirmishes happening all along the border with Syria and also along the border with Israel and even to a certain extent in Judah. So all of these three nations here knew that the Assyrian Empire was rising and was attempting to take more land. And so the northern kingdom and Syria, notice they share a border, they decided to ally and to fight against the Assyrians. They wanted the southern kingdom to join them. However, the southern kingdom was not interested. And so the Syro-Ephraimite War was actually the war of, remember, Israel, also known as Ephraim, and Syria. Syro-Ephraimite War was actually a war against Judah because they decided that they were going to kill the king Ahaz, who was in power at that time, and to trade him out essentially for a king who would be more amenable to their cause. However, Judah, Ahaz, went ahead and allied with the Assyrians, and they ended up crushing the northern empire, the northern kingdom, Israel. And so what happens is that a number of northern Israelites flee down to Judah during this time. And so all that to say is that Isaiah is written during this moment of incredible upheaval. And so as we read Isaiah and we see all these moments where Yahweh, through the voice of Isaiah, is chastising, a lot of it has to do with the geopolitical struggles that are at play here and how that affects their religious devotion, how that affects their ways of relating to each other socially. And so this context shapes, certainly at least, the first Isaiah. So let's do a little bit of reading of this book together. While I'm pulling up the passage, are there any questions or comments about that piece of this history, the context? Okay. So we just started with the superscription in chapter 1, the vision of Isaiah, son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Now we're going to skip, actually, to chapter 6. Okay. Notice, remember, we had that chapter 1, verse 1, we were in the realm of prose, and then what followed after that, which we'll go back to, we were in the realm of poetry. Now here we are back in prose. Would anyone be willing to read out loud this first paragraph here?
Sure. 6:1. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord seated on a throne, high and exalted, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphs, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, and 2 they covered their feet, and the 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory.
Thank you so much, CJ. Okay, what have we learned already here in this first few verses? What's stuck out to you?
It's sort of like I don't know, it's like with Revelation, it's like, is this a description of a fantastical dream, or is this, you know, uh a real situation that we're looking at in the temple? Um but we know that the king died, and God was sitting on the throne in the temple with angels.
Yeah, thank you for that, Bradley. Yeah, the the thing that we get immediately is a time, right? In the year that King Uzziah died. And remember back to that superscription where the book tells us that Isaiah had his visions during the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. So we already know that, in fact, what's happening here is that we're at the end of Uzziah's life. And then, to your point, Bradley, what Isaiah is seeing isn't exactly clear, or how. Is this a vision, or is this a report of what Isaiah literally saw? Nevertheless, what we know is that Isaiah saw the Lord seated on a throne with robes filling the temple, and above him were seraphim. Now, our understanding, just as you mentioned, Bradley, of seraphim is that they're angels. Seraphim, cherubim, we think of them as different classes of angels. However, in the ancient world, they were understood to be something else entirely. Notice that the seraphim had 6 wings. 2 wings they covered their faces, 2 they covered their feet, and 2 they were flying. Seraphim were actually depicted in the ancient world as these sort of hybrid beasts that were animals that had a head from one creature and wings from another and feet from another still. And so what we're in is a realm of vision that is odd. Even to readers of this time period, they would have found this odd. This is very unlike what most of the prophets do and discuss. They don't, unless you're talking about someone like Daniel, who has an apocalyptic vision. Many of the prophets don't necessarily engage in this sort of description of visions they're having, but they were calling to one another, the seraphim. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. Quick note here. Do you notice the difference between Lord as it's written here and Lord as it's written here? That is a result of the fact that we're trying in English to capture a difference between Hebrew words. Lord here is the use of someone who is, in the classical English sense, a landowner, someone who has a lot of power, who has a lot of wealth, who has a lot of stuff. Lord here, however, is sort of an English translation of the name Yahweh. That's why it's in all caps. And so that's just something for us to note and track again as we go on. So let's move down a little bit. At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Woe to me, I cried, I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. And my eyes have seen the King, the Lord, all caps, Almighty. Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With it he touched my mouth and said, See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for. Isaiah is feeling as if he is unfit, one, because he has seen God, which, if you remember from other places in the Hebrew scriptures, no one is allowed to do. Not even Moses sees God. Moses sees the back of God as God's moving away from him. Isaiah says, I am unfit to see God, to interact with God in this way. And then the seraphim burns his mouth with a hot coal and says, your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Already, for those of you who are familiar with Christian hymnology, you might recall some of these phrases. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. Whom shall I send? These are phrases that we find in hymns. And who will go for us? And I said, here am I, send me. Again, a lovely reference to, or the hymn is a lovely reference to this moment. It's a commissioning. Isaiah is being pointed to as the person who will go for Yahweh, us being the whole realm of divinity, to go and speak on their behalf. Yeah, CJ.
You just answered my question.
Okay.
The us, I was interested in that.
Yeah, the way that folks understand that is in a couple of different ways. One is that God is speaking on behalf of the holy realm, God, the seraphim, what have you. Others read this as sort of a royal us, a royal we, and we also see that in Genesis and in a couple of other places as well. And then God said to Isaiah, go and tell this people, be ever hearing, but never understanding. Be ever seeing, but never perceiving. Make the heart of this people calloused. Make their ears dull and close their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn and be healed. God is saying to Isaiah, limit the Judeans' ability to actually hear and perceive and understand. This is a very important passage for early Christians because it's one of the only passages in Isaiah that is quoted in all four of the Gospels. And so we'll talk about that when we get to, I think it's December 18th, is when we'll dive into what this passage meant in its original context and what it meant to early Christians and why Jesus, in all four Gospels, quotes it. But nevertheless, in this moment, Isaiah is being told to basically limit the people's ability to understand God. And then Isaiah says, for how long, Lord? And God answered, until the cities lie ruined and without inhabitant, until the houses are left deserted and the fields ruined and ravaged, until the Lord has sent everyone far away and the land is utterly forsaken. And though a tenth remains in the land, it will again be laid waste. But as the terebinth and oak leave stumps when they are cut down, so the holy seed will be the stump in the land. What is happening here? One way to understand what this passage is really all about is to see what Isaiah is describing as inevitable, as the Israelites, the Judeans being punished, as actually something that is a way of interpreting historical events. Remember back to the devastation of the Assyrian Empire on the kingdom of Israel, which then was sort of a precursor actually to the kingdom of Judah having to pay tribute to the Assyrian Empire for being saved. What Isaiah is doing here is saying, actually, all of that devastation that we went through, well, that was all part of a plan. That was actually all part of God's will for us. And so as we then look back at chapter 1, now that Isaiah has been commissioned, now we actually get Isaiah's prophecy. We actually get Isaiah's words to the Israelites, calling them a rebellious nation. Hear me, you heavens, listen, earth, for the Lord has spoken. I reared children, God said, and brought them up, but they have rebelled against me. So we're in this context of devastation, and Isaiah, this holy scripture, is giving a reason for it, actually, is trying to suggest that the devastation that the Israelites and the Judeans are going through is a result of their behavior. And what behavior is that? Well, I'm going to scroll down a little bit. We're still in chapter 1. Okay, here we go. Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Listen to the instruction of our God, you people of Gomorrah. The multitude of your sacrifices, what are they to me, says the Lord? I have more than enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fattened animals. I have no pleasure in the blood of bulls and lambs and goats. When you come to appear before me, who has asked this of you, this trampling of my courts? Stop bringing meaningless offerings. Your incense is detestable to me. New moons, Sabbaths, and convocations, I cannot bear your worthless assemblies. Your new moon feasts and your appointed festivals I hate with all my being. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of burying them. When you spread out your hands in prayer, I hide my eyes from you. Even when you offer many prayers, I am not listening. Your hands are full of blood. Wash and make yourselves clean. Take your evil deeds out of my sight and stop doing wrong. What do you make of that? What, if anything, jumps out to you about these verses here?
Um, for me, it's that their worship was in vain, and immediately as it started going through there, I thought about the Lord's Jesus's answer on several occasions when he was um, um, accused of doing things on the Sabbath. He would say, "I desire mercy and not sacrifice," and so I don't think their worship meant anything.
Yeah, thank you for that, CJ. We're definitely going to sense here that the worship that the people of Judah have been engaged in is not only inadequate, it actually is making God angry. And when we look down here, then, what God says to do: wash and make yourselves clean, take your evil deeds out of my sight, stop doing wrong. Then God says, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. So, in other words, all of the offerings, all of this performance of religious ritual and devotion, stop. What matters is learning to do right. What matters is seeking justice. What matters is defending the oppressed, taking up the cause of the orphan, pleading the case of the widow. And so here we get a sense that what Isaiah is invested in, what Isaiah says God is invested in, is a performance of religious devotion that is embodied through behavior, through moral rectitude, through seeking liberation for the oppressed, through making sure that those in need have what they need, rather than through empty devotion, those of burning it incense and sacrifices and what have you. And so, in our last few minutes, I'm going to invite you to take up Isaiah's invitation, actually, to think about how in your own life, in your own spirituality, in what ways might you be performing routine? In what ways might you challenge yourself to do more deep, more rich, more embodied spiritual work? In what ways might you engage in the work of learning to do right, or to seek justice, or to nurture love and compassion for those who need it? This is what Isaiah is saying to the people of Judah. This is what Isaiah is saying God has spoken to him and through him. And it's the setup, actually, for the whole rest of the book. And so it invites, again, thinking about the context and the content. This was a group of people who were in the throes of real struggle, something I think some of us here might be able to relate to in one way or another. And what the command, what the invitation is actually empty performance of religious practice isn't going to save you. That in fact, there are behaviors you need to look at and engage in. Any questions or thoughts about that before we come to a close?
I'm struck by how so many of us talked about how we aren't reading the news, or, that we're kind of unplugged during this period of strife that we're in, or that many of us feel like we're in. And I am among those people. And I've been having a major, kind of almost an existential crisis of realizing that I have spent most of my life believing that if I was very informed and very active politically, that I made a difference. And clearly that is not accurate. And I am in a period of deciding, do I just unplug? And I won't quit voting, and I continue to read headlines, but it, and what keeps me from feeling completely hopeless and just deciding to just drink all the time and go on trips or something is I know that what I do locally matters. I know my church matters. I know the lynching sites projects matter. I know that the Hooks Institute matters. But I think what I'm feeling right now is that all the reading I've done, of all the political news and analysis and trying to just really understand everything has been for naught, and is empty and stupid and a waste of time. And that, what I need to do is work locally and,
It's a
be up
beautiful,
close and personal.
yeah, absolutely. I think what I hear you naming, Carla, is a deeply personal, insightful way of kind of interpreting what Isaiah is describing as it relates to the realities that you're swimming in, that we're all swimming in. That in some ways, maybe some of the habits we had formed around civic engagement didn't quite do the work that we thought they were doing. That maybe that was sort of our version of burnt offerings and incense. And that in fact, what we're being challenged to do now is learn how to do right, how to seek justice, how to defend the oppressed at a local level, in an embodied way, in a relational manner. And so I think that that's a beautiful invitation for us to take up if that feels like where you're being drawn as you think about what we've discussed today. This group of people who are in the throes of geopolitical upheaval, who are in the throes of captivity and captivity, in fact, that would get much worse later on. How might some of these lessons apply to us today? And so, with that, I want to thank you all so much for being here, for sharing, for thinking, for diving into this fairly complex book. The next time we get together, we're going to talk more about Isaiah's invitations into justice, and we're going to talk more also about the structure of the book as a whole, and the ways that we see this movement from poetry and prose, and we see this movement from a book of basically angry exhortations for the first 40 chapters, and then suddenly we get to a book that's all about comfort, all about hope, all about inspiration. And so I thank you again, and I look forward to seeing those of you who can make it next week right here on Zoom. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Tony.
Good to see y'all.
Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, Tony.
Thank you.